On a soft pearl Tuesday morning in early August of 1987, in the gravel driveway of an 86-acre family hay farm on a narrow down East Maine point between Frenchman Bay and a small protected tidal cove called Bluebell, a polished 39-year-old Boston acquisitions partner in a perfectly cut charcoal summer suit, with no tie, stepped out of a clean dark green 1987 Volvo 240 station wagon with Massachusetts plates, walked up the weathered cedar shingle steps of a 1798 saltwater farmhouse, knocked twice on the screen door, and offered a 71-year-old retired Maine Lobster captain named Russ Boutilier $3,100,000 in cash for the ground his family had cut salt hay on, fished a single cove from, and slept in 7 straight generations of the same 1798 farmhouse on, since the spring of George Washington's second term. The man's name was Mitchell Trask. He was the lead acquisitions partner of Coastal Acquisitions Trust, LLC, a Boston-based seaside-development limited liability corporation that had bought, across the previous 4 Maine summers, 12 coastal properties between Kennebunkport and Bar Harbor. He had on a pale blue Oxford shirt, polished brown loafers, a heavy gold Princeton-class ring, and an expensive Movado watch. He had a leather Mark Cross portfolio open on Russ Boutilier's kitchen table within 4 minutes of his knock, and inside the portfolio was a glossy architect's site, rendering in color, titled Oceanside at Bluebell Cove, 38 Luxury Coastal Retreats. The rendering was very nicely drawn. The 1798 saltwater farmhouse Russ had been born in was, in Coastal Acquisitions' plan, the future Bluebell Heritage Reception Lodge, with its brick chimney, preserved as a guest amenity. The long, faded red shed row of post and beam outbuildings Russ's grandfather had built in 1879 was, in the plan, the future Captain's Equestrian Center. The hand-hewn granite block tide-fenced lower hayfield, where the family had cut salt hay since 1801, was, in the plan, lots 11 through 27, listed at $440,000 each. The small stony cove where Russ Boutilier had kept the Anna B., the 36-foot Novi-built lobster boat he had named for his wife in 1948, was, in the plan, the future members' yacht mooring anchorage. Mitchell Trask drank his coffee, slow. He explained, in the smooth, low voice he had been hired for, that $3,100,000 was 46% above the most recent Hancock County tax assessment, that it was 20% above any honest appraisal he had seen of coastal saltwater hayfield in down East Maine, that Russ's only daughter Linda, who lived in Portland and worked as a public school teacher, and Russ's only granddaughter, Hannah, who had just graduated Bowdoin College in May, could each receive a check that would, in plain language, take care of every concern either one of them was ever going to have about the future. Russ Boutilier listened to him for the full 43 minutes. He poured Mitchell Trask a fresh cup of coffee. He did not interrupt him. When Mitchell Trask was finished, Russ folded his square, work-hardened hands on the worn red and white oilcloth tabletop. The small carved cherry wood pipe rested between his right thumb and forefinger, unlit. The thin gold wedding band Anna Boutilier had put on his ring finger on the 3rd of September, 1947, caught the soft pearl morning light through the kitchen window over the cove, and he said one word. He said, "No." What Mitchell Trask did not know, sitting there in his Brooks Brothers summer suit in Russ Boutilier's saltwater kitchen, with $3,100,000 of Coastal Acquisitions Trust's money sitting in writing on the oilcloth, was that Russ Boutilier had buried Anna in the small clapboard Methodist cemetery on the back road 3 years earlier, that he had decided at her graveside exactly what the rest of his life was going to be about, and that his 23-year-old only granddaughter had, that same Tuesday morning, been walking the back pasture of the Boutilier Point for 31 straight mornings of her summer break, with a hand trowel, a canvas sketchbook, and a manila envelope of photocopies from the 1810 Hancock County Registry of Deeds. The Boutilier Point at Bluebell Cove had been deeded out of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the 12th of April, 1798, 3 years before the District of Maine became a state, to a 29-year-old Acadian-descended cooper from Behan, Castine named Pierre Boutilier for the sum of $140 in coined silver. Pierre Boutilier built the small white cedar-shingled saltwater farmhouse at the head of the cove in the spring and summer of that year with his own hands and his father-in-law's, and he and his Penobscot-born wife, Mary Wabanaki Boutilier, raised 6 children in the front bedroom of it. They cut salt hay on the lower marsh from the summer of 1801 forward, traded into the small early coastal salt works economy of Hancock County across the 1810s, and buried, in 1814, 3 of their 6 children in a single bad fever week that the family Bible still records. The point passed by direct father-to-son inheritance for 7 straight generations. Pierre to his eldest son Joseph in 1851, Joseph to his eldest son Etienne in 1888, Etienne to his eldest son Marcus in 1919, Marcus Russ Boutilier's grandfather to his eldest son Edmund in 1947, Edmund to his only son Russell in 1971, and Russell, who in 1987 was a widower with 1 daughter and 1 granddaughter, was by the soft pearl. Tuesday morning, Mitchell Trask laid down his portfolio, the last living Boutilier, on the point that bore the family name. Russ Boutilier had been born in the front bedroom of the 1798 farmhouse in March of 1916, in the same brass bed in which his grandfather Marcus had been born 71 years before him. He had gone to sea with his father Edmund at 14, run his own lobster boat at 22, served 2 years in the U.S. Coast Guard during the Second World War on a patrol cutter out of Eastport, come home in 1945, and bought with his Coast Guard discharge pay and a small bank loan from the Bar Harbor Savings Institution the 36-foot Novi-built lobster boat he named the Anna B. on the morning he married Anna Greer at the small clapboard Methodist church on the back road in September 1947. He and Anna had raised 1 daughter, Linda, born in 1951, in the same farmhouse Pierre Boutilier had built. They had cut salt hay on the lower marsh every August of every year from 1947 to 1983. They had fished the cove every season from the spring of 1948 to the autumn of 1981, when Russ had retired from lobstering at 65 and sold the Anna B. to a young man from the next cove south for $3,800, because Russ said it was time, and because Russ Boutilier had been right about every important time he had ever decided in his life. He had bought the 1948 International Harvester Farmall Cub brand new from the IH dealer in Ellsworth in May of 1948 for $985 cash, the entire profit of his first full lobster season as a married man. The cub had been delivered to the point on a stake-bed truck, offloaded with 3 planks and 4 neighbors, and parked under the long, faded red shed row by sundown. Russ Boutilier had run that small gray and red tractor on the lower hayfield every August of every year for the 39 straight summers since. He had cut salt hay on the same tide-fenced field his great-great-great-grandfather had cut salt hay on in 1801. He had never in 39 years bought a second tractor. Anna Boutilier, small, sharp-eyed, deeply read for a down-east Methodist farm wife, the granddaughter of a Brooklyn schoolteacher, and the librarian of the small Bluebell Cove Summer People Library for 31 years, had died of a quick aggressive lung cancer in the front bedroom of the 1798 farmhouse on the 7th of November, 1984, 3 weeks after the diagnosis. Russ Boutilier had sat on the edge of the brass bed in which she had died for almost an hour after the doctor and the minister had gone home. He had then, very carefully, walked the half-mile out to the lower hayfield, where the cub was parked at the end of the August row that Anna had ridden out beside him on, the way she had ridden out beside him every August row since 1948, and he had laid his hand flat on the gray hood of the cub for the better part of 1 full minute, and he had said out loud, in his quiet down-east voice with the faint Acadian French shape still at the edges, the one full sentence Mitchell Trask would never, in any of his 3 visits, hear. He had said, "Anna, I am not going to sell 1 square foot of this point, not the cove, not the house, not the marsh, not the tractor, not anything. I am going to keep the whole of it for the rest of my life, and then I am going to put it under cover so they cannot take it after I am gone. Either. I promise you that, here, today, in front of the cub." He had stood there for 1 long count in the cold November light off Frenchman Bay. Then he had walked back to the farmhouse. He had made supper for 1, and the next morning, very early, he had begun to think about how, exactly, a 68-year-old down-east lobster captain with a high school education was going to make good on the promise he had just made his late wife. For the first 3 visits, Coastal Acquisitions Trust, LLC, was extremely polite. Mitchell Trask came back to Bluebell Cove 4 days after the first morning with a new portfolio and a new number, $3,300,000. A heritage covenant pre-printed on Coastal Acquisitions letterhead promising that the 1798 farmhouse would be preserved in perpetuity as the development's signature historic structure. Russ Boutilier poured him a fresh cup of coffee. He listened. He refolded his hands around the unlit cherry wood pipe. He said no. Mitchell Trask came back the following Tuesday with $3,500,000. He brought, in addition to the portfolio, a soft-cover, hardcover-bound coffee table book Coastal Acquisitions had commissioned from a Boston design firm, 160 pages of glossy aerial photographs of the Boutilier Point and the cove and the lower hayfield, with handsome typography in 2 colors and a foreword by a former lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Russ Boutilier received the book politely. He set it on the windowsill in his kitchen. He said no. On the 3rd visit at the end of the 2nd week of August, on a hard, hot down-east day, with the cove flat as glass and a fog bank visible 8 miles off Frenchman Bay, Coastal Acquisitions sent a different partner. Carol Vance, 47, the firm's senior partner for community engagement, in a soft cream linen blazer and pearl earrings, with a different portfolio and a different angle. Carol Vance was, by half her career, an excellent listener. She listened to Russ Boutilier for nearly an hour. She asked him about Anna. She asked him about the cove. She asked him about the small clapboard Methodist church. She mentioned, very gently, that her own mother had been a Maine woman, from Bristol, on the Pemaquid Peninsula. She suggested, in the same gentle voice, that Russ might at least let Coastal Acquisitions help him understand his options before he closed any doors. Russ Boutilier listened to Carol Vance for the full hour, without interrupting. He poured her 2 cups of coffee. He set the cherrywood pipe down on the oilcloth between them, exactly once, with a small, careful click. He thanked her for her thoughtfulness about Anna. He said, "Ma'am, you're kind. The cove and the house and the hayfield and the tractor and the Methodist church are not for sale. They are not for sale at $3.5 million. They will not be for sale at $4 million. They will not be for sale at $5 million. They will not be for sale at any number anyone in Boston is ever going to put on a piece of paper. I would like, with respect, to ask you to thank Mr. Trask for me, and to ask him not to come back." Carol Vance, who was, by all accounts, a kind and competent person, and whose job at Coastal Acquisitions Trust would never quite recover from the Boutilier file, drove back to Boston that afternoon in her own clean Saab sedan, in tears, on Route 1. It was at that point in the last week of August 1987 that Coastal Acquisitions Trust stopped being polite. The first thing they did was buy an option, quietly, on the 17-acre Carver Place that bordered Russ Boutilier's southern fence line, a small saltwater farm owned by a 73-year-old Methodist widower named Henry Carver, whose 3 sons had moved to Connecticut. The option price was $920,000, against an honest appraisal of perhaps $360,000. The second thing they did was send a Coastal Acquisitions paralegal, very politely, to the Hancock County Registry of Deeds in Ellsworth and ask, as a matter of due diligence, for a re-review of the recorded boundary between the Boutilier and the Carver properties, a re-review which produced within 10 working days a Coastal Acquisitions Commission surveyor's letter formally suggesting that approximately 1 3/4 acres of the Boutilier Lower Hayfield may, on a 1798-era survey reading, properly belong to the Carver parcel, and inviting Russ Boutilier to engage counsel to address the question. The CI third thing they did was make a quiet phone call to the small Stonington Lobster Co-op that, although Russ had retired in 1981, still bought the small 2-trap recreational lobster catch he was permitted to keep under his Maine retired captain's license. The co-op manager, a 49-year-old man named Ned Crockett, who had been Russ Boutilier's nephew by marriage since 1962, took the call himself, listened politely for 2 minutes, told the Boston caller that, "You must have called the wrong co-op, sir. We don't know any Boutiliers in Stonington," hung up, and called Russ within 10 minutes from the co-op's wall phone. Ned Crockett told Russ exactly what had been asked, in exactly what tone of voice, and added in his careful down east English, "Russell, they are now coming for the cove from 3 sides. You should know that." Russ Boutilier listened to Ned Crockett for the full 2 minutes. He thanked him. He hung up the kitchen wall phone. He stood at the window over the cove for 1 long count of 3. Then he walked out to the back hall, took down his oilcloth bean barn coat from its peg, walked across the gravel driveway and across the lower hayfield to where his 23-year-old granddaughter, Hannah Boutilier, had been kneeling alone for the better part of an hour in the back pasture above the upper marsh, with a small hand trowel, a canvas sketchbook, and a manila envelope of photocopies from the 1810 Hancock County Registry of Deeds. Hannah Boutilier was 23 years old. She had just, in May of 1987, graduated from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, with a major in coastal history and a minor in archaeology. Her honors thesis, supervised by a 56-year-old Bowdoin coastal historian named Professor Margaret Halloran, had been an examination of the 7 Hancock County coastal saltworks operations that had functioned on down East Maine, points between 1801 and 1846, of which 6 were documented in the published Maine State Historical Record, and 1 Boutilier saltworks, Bluebell Cove, 1812 to 1819. Owner Pierre Boutilier was documented only in the original 1810 Hancock County Registry of Deeds plat, in a handwritten 1814 Bluebell Cove family Bible inscription, and in a single 1816 receipt for 124 bushels of evaporated salt sold to a Portland trader, which Hannah Boutilier had personally photocopied at the Maine Historical Society in Portland in March of 1986. For the entire summer of 1987, beginning the 2nd week of June, the day after she had moved her belongings from Brunswick to her grandfather's farmhouse for the summer, Hannah Boutilier had been walking the back pasture above the upper marsh of the Boutilier Point every morning between 5 and 7 a.m., with her hand trowel and her sketchbook and her photocopy envelope, and quietly looking on her grandfather's land for the physical remains of the Boutilier salt works of 1812. She had not told her grandfather what she was doing. She had told him she was sketching the cove for a project. Russ Boutilier, who in 53 summers had never asked one of his granddaughter's secrets to be told before its time, had not pressed her. By the 2nd week of August 1987, Hannah Boutilier had found in 3 separate locations across the upper back pasture the partially mossed and partially exposed top courses of 3 hand-hewn granite block foundations, each approximately 12 feet by 16 feet, set into the slope above the upper marsh at the precise compass bearings the 1810 plat had recorded. She had photographed all 3 with a borrowed Olympus OM 135mm camera. She had carefully mapped them by triangulation against the 1798 farmhouse and the granite-tied gate at the lower end of the marsh. She had, that morning of the Carol Vance visit, just located the iron-corroded base of what she believed, based on her honors thesis reading of 3 other documented Hancock County saltworks, was the original 1812 evaporation pan support of the Boutilier saltworks of Pierre Boutilier and Mary Wabanaki Boutilier. She had not yet told her grandfather any of it. She had been waiting, she said later, for the right moment. When Russ Boutilier crossed the lower hayfield in his bean barn coat that hard, hot August afternoon and found his only granddaughter kneeling at the third foundation with her hand trowel and her sketchbook, the right moment had come. Hannah Boutilier sat back on her heels, set the trowel down, looked up at her grandfather, and told him in 22 minutes of clear, careful Bowdoin coastal history English exactly what was under the back pasture, exactly what it had been, exactly what it meant, and exactly what could be done with it. She told him that what was buried in his back pasture was an archaeologically intact early American coastal industrial site, the first and oldest documented Acadian Penobscot family-owned saltworks in the state of Maine. She told him that under both Maine and federal law, the site was eligible for immediate listing on the National Register of Historic Places. She told him that her honors advisor, Professor Margaret Halloran of Bowdoin, who had read every page of Hannah's mapping notes across August by mail, was prepared to drive up from Brunswick the next morning to confirm the find personally. She told him that once the site was listed, which could happen in an emergency listing track in less than 90 days, and once a permanent archaeological conservation easement was recorded over the entire 86-acre Boutilier Point, no development of any kind could ever be approved on the property by the Hancock County Zoning Board, by the Maine State Department of Environmental Protection, by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or by anybody else, ever in perpetuity. By the operation of state and federal historic preservation law. She told him that the easement would also generate, against the appraised loss of development value, a federal charitable contribution deduction worth approximately $1,400,000, most of which her grandfather would never use, but which could be carried forward and applied against the taxable estate her mother Linda and Hannah herself would one day inherit. She told him, in plain language, by recording one archaeological conservation easement over a property she had just discovered was a 175-year-old Acadian Penobscot saltworks. They could permanently make the Boutilier Point worth, to a Boston developer, exactly nothing, and at the same time make it worth, to the family across the next 4 or 5 generations, far more, after taxes, than $3,100,000 had ever been worth to anyone. Russ Boutilier listened to his granddaughter for the full 22 minutes. He did not interrupt her. He stood at the edge of the third foundation, his bean barn coat unbuttoned to the August afternoon, the small cherry-wood pipe held loose in his right hand. When Hannah finished, Russ Boutilier was quiet for a long count of 5. He looked at the third foundation. He looked at the upper marsh. He looked down across his own lower hayfield, at the long, faded red shed row, at the 1798 farmhouse, at the cove and the bell buoy and the open Atlantic beyond. He looked last at his only granddaughter, who had the same calm gray eyes as Anna Greer Boutilier had had on the day she had ridden out beside him on the lower hay row for the first time in August of 1948. He took the small cherry-wood pipe between his teeth, still unlit, and he said, in his quiet down-east voice, with the faint Acadian French shape, still at the edges, "Hannah, drive to Brunswick tonight. Bring your professor up tomorrow. We will, by Friday, talk to a lawyer in Ellsworth. The Boutilier Point is going to belong to 7 more generations after you, and it is going to belong to none of them in Boston. Is that understood, daughter?" Hannah Boutilier, who had been holding her breath for the last 2 minutes, said, "Yes, papered." What Coastal Acquisitions Trust, LLC, did in the 4 days between Hannah Boutilier's afternoon on the back pasture and the Friday morning of her grandfather's appointment at the law firm in Ellsworth was in the polite language Russ Boutilier's Ellsworth attorney would use 8 months later in a Hancock County Superior Court, filing a fairly thorough demonstration of the patterns of conduct that mid-1980s coastal development limited liability corporations bring into otherwise quiet coastal Maine townships for a great many years after they should have been driven out. On the Wednesday morning, an anonymous tip arrived at the Maine Department of Marine Resources alleging that Russell Boutilier of Bluebell Cove was operating unregistered commercial lobster gear under his retired captain's recreational license. The Department of Marine Resources, which had known Russ Boutilier by name since 1947 and had inspected his two-trap retirement gear without incident every spring since 1981, was required by law to respond. They sent a young field officer the next morning. Russ Boutilier's two-trap gear was perfect. The young officer wrote it up as such. He apologized on his own initiative for the disruption. On the Thursday afternoon, 2 large laminated yard signs appeared overnight on the public road fence line of the Carver place that Coastal Acquisitions had now optioned, facing the back road approach to the Boutilier Point. The signs read, in bright blue printing, "Proposed Oceanside at Bluebell Cove. 38 luxury coastal retreats breaking ground, summer 1988. Hannah Boutilier saw them on her way home from Brunswick with Professor Halloran on Wednesday evening. She drove the rest of the way home, walked into the kitchen of the 1798 farmhouse, told her grandfather about the signs, and added in plain Bowdoin English that they had just, by the operation of Maine consumer protection law, made her grandfather's case for him. On the Friday morning, Russ Boutilier, his only daughter Linda, his only granddaughter Hannah, Professor Margaret Halloran of Bowdoin, and an Ellsworth attorney named Eli Burke, a 64-year-old retired Hancock County coastal property specialist who Russ Boutilier had known since they had served together on a small Coast Guard patrol out of Eastport in the spring of 1944, sat in the conference room of a small wood-paneled law firm on Main Street in Ellsworth, in the soft pearl August down east light, and signed together 3 documents in this exact order. They signed first an emergency application for Federal National Register of Historic Places, listing of the Boutilier Salt Works Archaeological Site at Bluebell Cove, Hancock County, Maine, prepared and notarized by Professor Halloran in collaboration with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission across the preceding 26 hours of professional all-night work. They signed, second, a 41-page perpetual archaeological conservation easement on every acre, every cedar shingle, every granite-tied gate, every line of stone wall, every spruce and fir line, every inch of upper marsh, every square foot of the 3 saltworks foundations, and every length of saltwater hayfield on the entire 86-acre Boutilier Point to be held in trust, in perpetuity, by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, with co-monitoring rights by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. They signed, third, a formal Hancock County Superior Court consumer protection complaint against Coastal Acquisitions Trust, LLC, on the simple grounds that Coastal Acquisitions had publicly represented, on roadside signage, to the citizens of Hancock County that they were breaking ground on a 38 luxury coastal retreat subdivision called Oceanside at Bluebell Cove on property that they did not own, did not have entitlement to, and could not, by the operation of Maine state and federal historic preservation law, as of that morning, ever entitle. By the end of August 1987, 11 days after Hannah Boutilier had set her hand trowel down in the back pasture, every option Coastal Acquisitions Trust had taken on every property adjoining the Boutilier Point was, quietly and with no comment, allowed to lapse. The Carver place reverted to ordinary unencumbered ownership by Henry Carver, who later that fall sold it directly to Russ Boutilier for the original honest appraisal of $360,000, financed by Russ at 4% against the Maine Coast Heritage Trust easement, in the only loan Russ Boutilier ever signed in his life. The yard signs came down on the 2nd of September by Coastal Acquisition's own crews, in a fog. Mitchell Trask was reassigned internally to a townhouse conversion file in Cambridge in late September. Carol Vance retired in November. Russ Boutilier lived another 23 years. He continued to cut salt hay on the lower hayfield every August with the 1948 Farmall cub until the summer of 2002 when he was 86, when his granddaughter Hannah, by then 38 years old, a married professor of coastal history at the University of Maine, and a Boutilier in her own right, quietly took over the August cutting. Russ continued to live in the 1798 farmhouse, in the same front bedroom where he and his grandfather and his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather had all been born until November of 2010. He died at 94 of a quiet stroke on the steps of the front porch on a clear, cold November afternoon, with the small carved cherry wood pipe still in his right hand and the soft sound of the Bluebell Cove bell buoy carrying up from the water. The Boutilier Point is owned today by Hannah Boutilier Reed, 60, who lives in the 1798 farmhouse with her husband and her own son, a 7-year-old boy named Russell Boutilier Reed, who is being taught slowly, the way Boutiliers have always taught Boutiliers, anything how to start the 1948 Farmall cub. The lower hayfield is still cut every August. The 3 saltworks foundations in the back pasture are preserved under the easement. A small brass plaque on the granite tied gate, set there by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission in 1989, reads only, Boutilier Saltworks, 1812 to 1819, Pierre Boutilier and Mary Wabanaki Boutilier, preserved by Russell Boutilier and Hannah Boutilier, 1987. And on the back wall of the small Bowdoin College Department of Coastal History office in Brunswick, Maine, where Hannah Boutilier Reed still occasionally gives a guest lecture every spring, hangs a single-framed black-and-white photograph from the 3rd week of August 1987, taken with Hannah's borrowed Olympus OM1 on Plus X film by Professor Margaret Halloran herself. The photograph shows a 71-year-old retired Down East lobster captain in an oilcloth bean barn coat, standing at the edge of the 3rd foundation of an early American Acadian Penobscot saltworks on his own back pasture above his own upper marsh, with his 23-year-old granddaughter beside him, his small carved cherry wood pipe loose in his right hand, looking out past the lower hayfield and the long faded red shed row, and the 1798 saltwater farmhouse, and the small stony cove and the open Atlantic at a piece of ground and a piece of water that no Boston Development Limited Liability Corporation, no acquisitions partner, no roadside signage, no anonymous tip to the Maine Department of Marine Resources, no surveyed boundary rereading, no late 1980s coastal Maine real estate aggregator on Earth would ever be allowed to move. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it on this channel: Forgotten Machines, Quiet People, and the Work They Did. Subscribe, and we'll tell you the next one.